Hello all. Welcome everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. My name's Justin Bassey. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and it is a real pleasure to be able to open this event and welcome you all here today. I'm really pleased to have with us this evening New York Times White House and National Security Correspondent David Sanger, who's just getting mic'd up out the back in Canberra and at ASPI here for this event on national security, disinformation and the media. David really needs no introduction, but just a few little points on him. He's, of course, a Pulitzer-prize winning journalist with more than 4 decades of experience. He's the author of several books, including a superb book that many in Canberra know on cyber warfare titled The Perfect Weapon, and a new book, New Cold Wars, plural, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. David's visiting Australia as a fellow of our good friends at the United States Studies Centre, and it's great of them to have been able to share David with us for this evening. We are very, very pleased to have David join us to share his extensive wisdom on geopolitics, technology and security, although, as we'll find out tonight, it's more about insecurity, unfortunately, than security. After years of relative stability, other than terrorism, we are now in a period of global instability, with war in Europe, war in the Middle East, tensions in the South China Sea, all amplified and supercharged by the abuse of the very technologies that were designed to bring us closer together. The reality is, unless we take our own active measures, we'll become more divided and vulnerable to those with malign intent, whether they be individuals, criminal groups, or rogue states such as Russia and China. In a recent conversation with NATO's Deputy for Hybrid Threats, James Apatorai, he shared a terrifying figure that within the next 4 years, NATO assessed that 90% of what is on the internet will be fake. This means that we're not only grappling with unprecedented levels of disinformation, but growing distrust in accurate information. The assessment years ago that the counter to disinformation was information is no longer as simple an equation. As democracies, the question is, how do we protect our values, such as freedom of speech and expression, while simultaneously protecting our societies within a framework of rules and laws? The solution is surely not to become authoritarian ourselves and to prohibit technology or to prohibit social media, but rather to double down on our freedoms to ensure that people feel empowered to disagree, feel empowered to hold views, even where those views may be viewed as extreme, but with full awareness that there would be no tolerance for harming others, whether through intimidation, hate speech, or violence. Just this week, here in Australia, we've seen the terror threat level rise from possible to probable, with a major part of that security assessment seemingly the impact of technology on society, including the online world being the modern-day meeting place for individuals with diverse grievances to come together, legitimize themselves and to radicalize themselves and others. The assessment is that there is a lack of trust in the very institutions designed to keep people both informed and safe. The media, for example, is supposed to be the institution designed to keep people informed. But how does that happen when there is distrust in the mainstream media, as well as a significant shift away from the way that people receive their information and the accuracy of their sources? So I've had the very easy job to outline a number of the problems and pose a number of questions without actually giving any solutions. But it's lucky for us, it's lucky for us all here to have both David Sanger and our very own David Wroe, ASPI's Director of Strategic Communications, to guide us on how not only to survive our current era of technological instability, but to thrive. David's over to you.
Thanks, Justin, and welcome, David. It's a great thrill to have you here. I've read as much as I could of New Cold Wars before we sat down. I'm an embarrassingly slow reader, so I apologize. I haven't got through all that much of it, but it's I can assure everyone it's a wonderfully rich book in terms of detail and packed with insights. Every page, every paragraph is full of insights that you will want to dwell on. So it's not a book to speed read. It's certainly one for someone like me who likes to take their time with it. Now, David has vowed to sign books until there are none left to sign. I think those were his exact words. The people from Paper Chain, our favourite bookstore, they've got a desk set up just outside there, as you might have seen as you came in. So grab a copy, and David's happy to sign them at the end. Just a personal reflection. David's been a journalistic hero of mine, so I'm feeling pretty nervous up here. But frankly, he's really in the top, tiny 0.001% of national security writers, certainly writing in English around the world. If you were to assemble a dream team, if you were setting up a new media organization and you were scouring the world for the top journalists, you'd be crazy not to put him on your short list for a national security writer. Just for a bit of context, David's obviously been at the press club today. Hopefully some of you caught it. You can watch it online, as well as the US Studies Centre remarks that he made on Monday night. Just to distinguish ourselves a little bit from those sessions, I'm going to cover a bit of geopolitics, but then sort of dive into particularly information, disinformation, the role of the media, those sorts of areas. That's also a big area of interest for ASPI. We've got some fantastic researchers, some of whom are here in the audience, who do amazing work in that area. So we'll talk until probably half an hour, 35 minutes, something like that, and then we'll go to the audience for questions. So David, I'm just going to start off by asking you a bit about the book. Perhaps you could talk through the thesis, what you were hoping to accomplish, how you went about it.
Well, first, David, thank you very much. It's great to be here at ASPI and great to be back in Australia. I used to be in and out of Australia a lot when I was the Times bureau chief in Tokyo, but unfortunately that was 30 years ago. I've been back episodically since. Now I've been here 4 days, so I'm completely expert in all of your systems here. So anything that I say that is embarrassing about Australian politics or your geopolitical situation, it comes from some combination of not having been here in 3 or 4 years and jet lag. So there you go. And thank you for your very kind introduction. If my mother had been around to hear it, she would have believed you. If my editors were here, they would have broken out laughing. So it was very kind of you. So New Cold Wars is a book about what was in many ways the great shock that the West and Western allies had, that they misjudged where we would be at this point in geopolitical history. When I left Japan and came back to Washington in 1994, exactly 30 years ago, there was just a widespread assumption that Russia and China, each in their own ways, would sign up to Western institutions, would join the WTO in the case of China, the European Union in the case of Russia. There was talk that Russia might even join NATO, the very alliance that was set up to contain the old Soviet Union. And that while they would not become Jeffersonian democracies, they wouldn't even look like Japan or Australia. There would be some mix of authoritarianism and some local democratic practices. They fundamentally wouldn't challenge the system. So here we are, 30 years later, at the edge of war with Russia, providing arms for a vicious battle for Ukraine, for exactly the kind of territorial expansion that no one thought was possible in Europe again. I mean, why would Russia threaten their ability to ship oil and gas to their main market simply to gain back a bit more territory that to the West, who needs it? And China the country that we thought was communist in name only, but fundamentally capitalist in its operations with Chinese characteristics, as they used to say, also wouldn't threaten its market access by getting into a confrontation with Taiwan, by expanding down in the South China Sea, by ramming its boats into Philippine boats over spits of land that you'd have to be a really good geography student to even go find on the map. Why would they bother? And so the fundamental question I set out to answer with Mary Brooks, my researcher and co-writer for part of this, is what went wrong? Was this faulty intelligence? Was it wishful thinking? Was it projecting our values that trade and profit making would win out over everything else, a view that most American presidents I have covered have signed on to, and no one signed on to in greater form than Donald Trump, who thought that Iran would come around for a great deal after he pulled out of the 2015 agreement, that the Chinese would simply be brought out by a good trade deal and so forth. Or was there something more fundamental that we missed? And the first 150 pages of the book take you through that history in a reporter's way, not in a historian or academic's way, particularly. There's a scene in the first chapter floating down the Never River. You've probably been through this, where George W. Bush and his wife Laura and Putin and his then wife are on a yacht as Bush is visiting, one of the many visits he was making to try to get an alliance together on counterterrorism. And they're chatting on this boat while the sun is setting beautifully over the Hermitage and all that. I was on this trip. And the discussion that was taking place on the yacht was all about Russia integrating with Europe. And yet by 2007, there was Putin at the Munich Security Conference declaring there are parts of Russia, Peter the Great's Russia, not the old Soviet Union. He thought the Soviet leaders were idiots who had given too much power to the Soviet republics. But there were parts of Peter the Great's Russia that had been ripped apart and had to come back. And by 2014, he's taking Crimea back, and it took the West a year to get organized. And the next year, Chancellor Merkel of Germany signs the Nord Stream 2 agreement and declares that Putin is a reliable supplier of oil and gas, and that the pipeline, which would ship gas around, not through, but around Ukraine and into Europe, was going to be a great success and somehow integrate. We missed every opportunity to see where they were really going and excused every variation from our pathway and over-celebrated every act of cooperation, whether it was climate or containing North Korea's nuclear program or Iran's. With China, it was a different story. There were a series of presidents who were slowly liberalizing, I wouldn't say democratizing, and there was a medium free press. You couldn't attack the leaders of the government, but you could certainly go after polluting state-run companies that were taking bribes and dumping chemicals into the drinking water. Right? You could call that out. And then came Xi Jinping, who American intelligence believed would promote internal growth, was worried more about unemployment than anything else, wouldn't challenge the United States. And then we began to see the cyber activity that resulted in the theft of 22 million security clearance files in the United States. Then we saw the insertion of malware into our pipelines and our electric grid. Then we saw the battles with the Philippines, the assurance to the United States there would be no effort to militarize the new islands in the South China Sea, whereupon the New York Times publishes photographs of fighter jets landing on the new runways that they put out there. The crackdown on media. The New York Times, through the Cold War, kept bureaus open in both Moscow and Beijing. We had to clear everybody out of Moscow when the new national security law passed, because if we called what was going on in Ukraine a war, whoever was writing that in Moscow was subject to 15 years in jail. You saw what it took to get one single Wall Street Journal reporter out of the country. And we find ourselves in a situation now where Russia and China are, in a way that we have not seen in generations, coming together, not in an alliance, but in a partnership that I explore at some length as I take you in the book inside the Biden administration as they tried to go deal with this. And overlaying it all is an increasing use of misinformation, disinformation, not to score huge victories, but to shape the battlefield, to try to make sure that the fundamental argument that democracy is not all that it is made out to be is reinforced to their internal populations as well as to the rest of the world.
Absolutely. So we misjudged. I'm going to stick with China for a moment because we're in the Indo-Pacific, and also it's a sort of somewhat meatier subject in terms of the complexity of the relations that we have with it. We had an expectation about the way that it would, the trajectory that it would go on, or it obviously turned out to have very different ideas. Presuming we have learned from the mistakes that we made back in the 1990s, the 2000s, and early into the 2010s, as we engage with it, as we look to shape its behavior and try and find a new settling point for our relations with it, what is the most realistic, plausible scenario that you can actually foresee in terms of what our goal should be?
Well, there's what I can foresee, and there's where American and the Allies' strategy is. What worries me about the strategy at the end of the Biden administration, and the book is relatively complimentary of the fact that they woke up, began to develop a complementary strategy of building our own capacity, particularly for semiconductors, restricting the shipment of the most advanced semiconductors and other high-tech equipment to China so that they couldn't dominate or even catch up in large language models for AI, in the most advanced technologies for building military equipment. So this is the new form of containment. But what we're doing there is buying time. We are not getting to what you suggest in your question, which is what's an end state, right?
Yep.
And I'm not sure in this administration I have seen, for all of the good work they have gone, a well-defined end state goal. So we all know that China would like, by 2049, the 100th anniversary of Mao's revolution, to be the largest military power, the largest economic power, the largest technological power, through TikTok and other things, even a very large, if not the largest, cultural power. In other words, they want to use all the hard power and soft power elements together to upend an American role for an America they believe is in terminal decline. And I think the leadership of China looks at the U.S. and have convinced themselves that we are in decline. And certainly we have done everything we possibly can to help them along in that understanding in just the past couple of months, right?
Mm-hmm.
We may be pulling out from that, but I'm not certain that we are. So then the question that you're asking is, what would be an alternative outcome? Are we trying to stop the Chinese growth? Are we trying to slow it? if we're trying to slow it and create ourselves some time, are we using that time well enough? Are we building new semiconductor capacity in the United States fast enough to avoid dependency? Are we truly decoupling those critical industries, those supply chains we worry about the most? Are we making enough progress fast enough in artificial intelligence to stay out ahead of them? Can we come up with new ways of detecting Chinese efforts or Russian efforts to manipulate information so that you can expose it as it's happening in real time? And the answer to all those questions, to my mind, is we're on the right track now, but we are not moving anywhere near fast enough. One example, the CHIPS Act, which I think was one of the most progressive research and development and industrial policy efforts that the Biden administration got through, provides $52 billion for new semiconductor plants in the United States as seed money, and it's already attracted several hundred billion more. The problem is every new semiconductor fab costs, for the most advanced semiconductors, costs $15 to $20 billion to build. And you build them in 2 packs so that they are fed by the same water supplies and so forth. These are the fabs that can produce 7 nanometer or less circuit sizes, and thus move. These are the NVIDIA chips, for example, used for AI. But those same plants at Taiwan Semiconductor, which is the only place that really produces this stuff right now, also produce the microprocessors that are used in your iPhone. And so we're in this odd race against time that I describe in the book, where we're trying to hold off the time that there would be an invasion or slow squeeze of Taiwan so that we can build up this capacity. And yet the Chinese are in this debate about how much can they risk losing Taiwan Semiconductor themselves, because they can't build those chips yet either. So the closest thing to an end game we have right now is this effort to sort of keep them in the third rank of the race while we train Olympians.
One of the factors, no doubt, and you've touched on this, is the partnerships that they have with, partnerships that authoritarian powers have with each other. Obviously, there's the No Limits partnership between Russia and China. There's also Iran. There's North Korea. There's some of the
axis of the aggrieved.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
I'm really just curious about this one, and it could be a short answer on your part. But you managed to get Joe Biden recently in a press conference to reveal that the US was indeed pursuing a strategy of driving a wedge between China and Russia. Fascinating revelation for Biden to make in public. Are you able to speculate at all? I mean, he didn't say what they were doing, obviously, and you've said so this. Obviously, some of it's in the covert realm. But are you able to speculate at all on what they might be doing? What the opportunity?
This came up in the press conference just a few weeks ago. It was just days before he pulled out of the race, and the press conference was intended to show that he was ready to, handle any topic in a way that he did not in the debate, to put it as politely as I can. That question had 2 objectives to it. I wrote later on what we call a Times Insider piece about how we constructed the question going into this. There was hours put into it because it had 2 purposes. One was I wanted to get on the record from the president himself that the United States was indeed pursuing a policy to divide Russia and China, the way Nixon and Kissinger had in 1972 when they did the opening to China. That was the main goal. But I confess to a second objective in asking that question, which was Biden had been asked any number of times since the debate, are you up to the job in the way that you were a few years ago? And will you be up to the job a few years from now, given your age and whatever decline may be causing his decline, which may just be the fact that he's 81? And so the question was designed a bit as a cognitive test as well, to see if he could describe a strategy in public in front of the cameras to us on a topic that I knew he dealt with Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, with Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, several times a week. And this is a constant subject of conversation in national security circles in the White House, which is, what do you do about the Russia-China axis? And he wound around for a bit, and I had to interrupt him once, but finally he said, yes, that is our policy, and I'm not going to give you much detail about it, which left the impression that much of what we're doing right now is sort of covert activity to get in the way of, say, those technology transfers between China and Russia to help rebuild the Russian military and go after the Ukrainians. But if you think back to the old Cold War, it's got to be more than that. You're not going to sanction your way to separating two countries that have even temporarily mutual interests. You're going to have an all of government and all of allies strategy to keep them from working together. And I don't think there's been enough discussion between the United States and its European allies, or the United States and Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, about how to make this strategy work. And I suspect if you talk to the Australian leadership, unless it came up today in the strategic dialogue in Annapolis that your foreign minister and defense minister are at, that there's been much conversation on this at all.
Right, okay. One of the core messages, and you've touched on this for both Russia and China, is that, and you pointed out that Beijing apparently genuinely believes that the democracy is on the decline. It's doomed, it's failing. Autocracy is more effective, it's more efficient. I'm curious to know whether you think that message is landing, particularly in the US, and I'm thinking of vox pops that I've seen in US media from MAGA rallies where respondents are saying, well, yeah, Putin's on the other side, but he's just standing up for his country. And, they're expressing admiration for his particular brand of nationalism. He's getting the best for his people. And he's throwing everything he can into the fight in this zero-sum game. We should be doing exactly the same thing, but just doing it better. That's the only way to get ahead in the world, because that's the way the world runs. So I'm curious. I mean, are those messages, are those narratives that Beijing and Moscow are projecting into the West? And we saw it in that sorry excuse for an interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin as well. Are those messages landing, do you think? And might that help explain some of the declining faith in democracy that we're seeing in the West, or is that self-inflicted?
A little of both. I mean, first of all, take a look at the leaders who Donald Trump has publicly praised and said he admires. Putin, when the invasion of Ukraine happened, as President Biden noted at that press conference, President Trump's first instinct was to say, this is a brilliant power move on his part. It was, really well executed. Then all of a sudden there was an uproar that it turned out that Putin, who knew, was violating any number of international legal norms by invading a sovereign state nearby. And you heard Trump pull back on that a little bit. Orban, who's, got everything but membership at Mar-a-Lago at this point, but has been down to visit on more than one occasion. A grudging admiration of Xi Jinping when he is not lambasting the Chinese for triggering COVID. So the MAGA crowd has picked up on this new approach. It's a remarkably different view for the Republican Party. I mean, it was only 2005 when President Bush, the second President Bush, in his second inaugural address, said it will be the mission of the United States to defend and expand liberty around the world for the next couldn't remember if he said 70 years, 100 years, whatever. In other words, it was an American mission to promote democracy. Even if democracy is not the world's greatest export, it's a good import if you want it, but we've proven it's not a great export. They've gone from that to admiring some of the world's great authoritarians. When you look at the polling data, and opponents of President Trump in the United States are appalled by the effort to manipulate the election results, to try to fix the certification on January 6th, the riots on January 6th at the Capitol, and so forth. That group will not poll very heavily about putting democracy at the top of the agenda. Biden, on the other hand, in his early years as president, talked about how these next few years are a battle between autocracy and democracy. And that turned out to be oversimplified, as he discovered when he went and fist bumped MBS in Saudi Arabia, right? A trip that half of his advisors thought was a really bad idea, and the other half thought was a necessity. So we're in a situation today where, should Trump come back, I think you will see the United States abandon most of its public objections and sanction systems against autocrats who are behaving badly, but who have Trump's admiration. It would be interesting to see what happens if Vice President Harris gets elected. She's just selected a running mate who spent a fair bit of time in China as a young man, who has expressed pretty strong opinions on the human rights situation, but not that much on the geopolitical contest that we were just discussing.
I mean, Biden's early and, as you say, relatively short-lived effort to cast the strategic competition as one of democracies versus autocracies. I mean, were you personally skeptical about that? Did you think that it wasn't going to work? I mean, I suppose I wonder if there isn't space for leaders to say, well, democracy can be a fulcrum around which we can cooperate, and it's a value that we share, and it can be it can serve as a large sort of overlapping motivation in our work together. Of course, that doesn't mean that we only work with democracies. Sometimes, yes, you have to work with countries that don't necessarily meet all of your.
That should have been the message from the beginning,
right?
And I think there were many members of the administration, including Vice President Harris, who were a little leery of the simplicity of the autocracy versus democracy thing. Go back through her speeches, and there's a martini for anybody who can find her to go using that same phrase of democracy versus autocracy. I have not found it in her speeches.
Interesting. Moving on to disinformation, I mean, obviously the dramatic changes in technology are now affording malign actors extraordinary new powers to pursue disinformation campaigns. Tell me a bit of your views on the risks that we face in the future, in which, and Justin touched on this in his opening remarks, a future in which it's very hard for people to know what to trust, what to believe. They don't know which way is up and which way is down, effectively, and so we end up with a chaotic, I'm going to call it an infoscape, which is a word I just sort of made up earlier today, but where you have the best manipulators, the ones who are most powerful, most skilled, who have the best ability to manipulate algorithms and appeal to our emotions and our base instincts. They become the most powerful players in this new information space. I mean, is that a sort of dystopian future you can envisage?
You could. Look, there's nothing new about propaganda and disinformation. We had a good deal of it in the opening of our own republic in the United States. If you go back to the partisan newspapers of Jefferson's era, there was, a fair bit of disinfo. They didn't have the ability to manipulate pictures because they didn't have pictures in the newspapers. But there was a fair bit of this. Stalin used to place articles that were written by Soviet agents in farm newspapers around the United States, just to see if he could sow some questioning of institutions, disbelief, anger at the government, and so forth. The difference now is twofold. First, speed, with everybody getting their news from a device in their pocket, you can spread this stuff much more than you did before. And second, a feedback loop of data to see whether or not people are taking it up and believing it, right? So we spend a lot of time at the New York Times looking at disinformation campaigns. We looked in detail at an odd one last summer that sent the lesson that frequently the Chinese or the Russians can put a lot of effort into this and they don't work. So you remember the fires that took place in Hawaii just about a year ago that wiped out some complete towns in Hawaii? So the Chinese picked up on a true fact, which is that the US military has some facilities to do laser experimentation, space laser experimentation, up on the top of one of the volcanoes on the island that had a lot of the fires. The facility's been there for years. I remember bicycling up the volcano side one time on vacation, and you would see these facilities off in the distance, and that was a while ago because I'm not sure I'd be in the shape to go bicycle up one of those volcanoes today. But the articles that they were promoting said that actually these fires were set by the U.S. government because a experimentation to take out satellites had gone wrong, and it triggered the fire down at the bottom of the volcano. It was complete garbage, but they were replicating it all over the place. And it's interesting, it didn't take off.
Right.
Okay. But what did it send off in our sort of spidey sense? This is exactly the kind of experimentation the Russians played with in 2015 before they got it sort of better and right in 2016. And so one of the things we're looking for is evidence that Russia or China or Iran, and those are the three that have been identified by the Director of National Intelligence of the U.S. in the U.S. as active right now, are trying to go influence this election. I actually think in many ways, David, they're not likely to be terribly successful, because one thing that disinformation talent needs is a little bit of time to let things set in. And our system has been so chaotic. We've changed one of the presidential candidates. We've introduced now a new vice president who was on no one's radar 3 weeks ago, right? Minnesota governor. If you had said the Minnesota governor was going to be on the ballot, I think people might have looked at you into askance and taken a step back. And right now, the campaign is so sort of confused on different issues, it's sort of difficult to sort of take hold. So while we're all going to be looking for disinformation, I'm not sure that we're going to see a huge amount between now and 90 days from now.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the last time around, 2016, I mean, we'll never know whether it helped Trump get over the line or not. But what we do know is that it created 8 years now of opportunity costs in terms of U.S. politics, and
That's right.
It absorbed all of this manic effort in.
And you may remember that in 2016, look, a team of us worked on the Russian interference stuff and won a Pulitzer for it in the following year. But in 2016, all we knew about was the effort to steal data from the registration systems of states and cyber activity. It wasn't until the next year, looking backwards, that we saw the disinformation campaign, right? Today, our detection systems are so much better. Microsoft, Google, others have invested tens of millions of dollars in buying up companies that are good at tracking this kind of stuff. In fact, Microsoft's unit to do it is directly opposite the New York Times headquarters in New York. But they put out reports every single week. I just got one this morning, embargoed a few days, from another company that's examining these. So it's a little bit harder for the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians to get away with this stuff undetected. Now, that said, if they can find a really good theme and it resonates off of real news, they can influence a good number of people.
So, I mean, yes, there's been a lot of change in candidates, there's been a lot of change in politics, but a lot of the divisions in American society and American politics are just as entrenched, if not more entrenched, than they were in 2016, aren't they? So aren't there some obvious... I mean,
there's something to work with there.
Yeah,
yes.
That's right.
But you're getting at a critical point for democracies, which is we created those divisions in our own system. We didn't actually need any... Turns out we don't really need Chinese and Russian help to divide American society. We're doing a fine job of that all by ourselves. But then once that happens, they go in and amplify it. And that's the big difference from 2016 to today. In 2016, you had these trolls working away at the Internet Research Agency in a big building in St. Petersburg, not far from where we floated down the Neva River. Prigozhin's operation was right down near the river there. And they were making up stuff to put up on the web, right? It turns out now we're pretty good at finding stuff that's coming in from overseas and doing it. So they have changed tactics. And what they're doing is waiting for real Americans with real First Amendment rights to turn out some crazy conspiracy theory and then grab on that and amplify it, because it's not easy for Microsoft or X or Google or anybody else to take a real American's First Amendment protected views and pull them off the web.
I'm conscious of the time, and I'm going to throw to the audience soon, but I'm going to ask one more. And that's about the role of the news media in this. I mean, clearly, in this information environment where it's difficult for people to orientate themselves, being able to turn to, say, the New York Times or some other reputable media organization that they can trust that organization to provide them with facts and give them a worldview based in truth, that then they can go out and engage with their fellow citizens on a reasonable basis and with the rest of society if they have that trust. So, how robust is that trust in news media? How do we maintain and where necessary rebuild it? And also not just news media, but also other traditional authoritative institutions.
So it's nowhere near where it wants to be. Go look at polling data. We're ranked below lawyers.
Yeah.
I mean, that really hurts.
Although we always have been, right? I mean,
we're ranked sometimes below Congress. So imagine that.
Right now.
Yeah. Okay. That's for several reasons. First of all, we saw Donald Trump explicitly go after the New York Times and other mainstream news organizations, and he was very clear to us one point about why he does this, because he said, one day you're going to write a story that I don't like. Well, every day we probably write a story that he doesn't like at some point or another, and I want to be able to shake people's trust in the organization. Basically, he didn't quite say it quite that directly, but so denigrating the mainstream media as fake news is an effort of seeding the ground to charge us with making this stuff up later. So that's number one. Number two is the fracturing of electronic media in particular back to sort of more partisan world. I mean, Fox News began this process more than 20 years ago. once it was clear that there was a group of tens of millions of people who would tune in to a partisan-driven news show, then what happened? MSNBC got created, which became sort of the left out there. I'm a contributor to CNN. CNN sees itself, I think rightly, as a straight-on news organization, but President Trump accused it as well at many times, and I'm sure will again. You see this in his effort to move the debate away from ABC, the next debate, which he maintains is a mainstream media group hostile to him, and says, I'll debate on a different night, and only if it's Fox News, and only if we can bring in an audience so it resembles a rally more than a real debate, right? So all of these things contribute into it. And then on top of the fracturing of the media, you have people spreading stories, disinformation, and making up conspiracy theories that the mainstream media is keeping you from knowing this stuff. It's a very hard thing for democracies to fight. Do you want the government calling this stuff out? Well, that strikes me as a pretty bad idea, because the government will change, if it's in Joe Biden's hands versus Donald Trump's hands, what those government panels define as fake news could be quite different. And in a world where you want First Amendment protected press, that means you don't want the government making those kinds of judgments. That is, by the way, not completely the deal when you are dealing with other democracies, including Australia and Britain, where I think the government plays a bigger role in information spread. But I'm not sure it works for us. And as a result, I don't think you can be in a position where news organizations are working with the government about defining what is true.
What about just government, sorry to tack one last one on, but what about government support for independent media, like basically national broadcasters? We have a successful broadcaster here, BBC in the UK. I know you guys have PBS and...
Right. So we have diminishing amounts of federal money going to groups like PBS, NPR, and all that. Former President Trump's been very clear that he believes those groups are designed to embarrass him, and that he would zero out that money. And I think people, within those networks now are sort of preparing for a world in which they don't want to be dependent for their budgets on the US government. And frankly, I'm uncomfortable with government support of independent media because it's not all that independent. Now, Voice of America, through the Cold War, did a pretty good job of maintaining credibility because people listened to it and then discovered later on that they were fundamentally reporting true facts and not propaganda. But I don't think the US government, with the population this divided, is going to be a consistent provider of funding for independent media in this regard.
Okay, interesting. All right, as promised, I'll go to the audience for questions. If you have one, please put your hand up. Normal rules apply. Please give your name and any relevant affiliation. Please ask one short question, no statements. That way we'll get through some more. And we've got some roving mics, so just put up your hand. Yes, sir. We've got a mic.
Hold on one second. Microphone's coming to
you. Your voice does sound loud enough.
Normally is. Ash Barnett from Melbourne University. I'll preface this question by saying I really agreed with the conclusions you came to in your book. Found a fascinating sort of outline of the strategic reasoning going behind some of these policy decisions. But I just want to hear your thoughts to a possible objection. It's very good on the dangers of being overly optimistic about a competitor or an adversary, the arguments you outline in your book. But there's also a possible danger of being too pessimistic. I'm thinking particularly in China, sometimes it can become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because when you act with a pessimistic view of an adversary, you might be acting out of in a defensive way, but it can be interpreted by your adversary as being an offensive or aggressive move. Wondering if you had any kind of thoughts to that type.
You're warning of something that is a very real risk that we run. which is there's very little, as you know, in the United States right now that unifies Democrats and Republicans, but they're in a race for who can do meaner things to China, in a bigger hurry. And some of them aren't so wise. I'll give you an example. The FBI ran this ill-conceived effort to go pursue university researchers who they believe were funneling things to China. I'm sure some were, but they had a series of prosecutions that failed, and it ended up looking like sort of a return to the McCarthy era, and they had to sort of kill the program. And that was only because it sort of got exposed in public, and I think there were a lot of pretty poor cases that were brought. So that's one example. We've seen laws in Florida prohibiting the purchase by people who are Chinese nationals of land or apartments or houses within X number of miles of American military bases. Well, there are huge American military bases in Florida, so that is excluding an ethnic group from being able to go buy a house or invest in a property. I'm not sure what you learn from living 5 miles from an American airfield. And if the Chinese really want to listen into the communications of those airfields, something tells me they've got better space capabilities to go do that. And they really don't need a condo on the beach in order to go make that case. So I worry that we get ourselves into one of these cycles of destruction. One of the things I would do is try to go resume as quickly as we could the interchange of students between the two countries. Yeah, some will be there to steal data, absolutely. Yes, having more Chinese in the United States means that the CIA's got a bigger group to go recruit from. They won't admit that, but they will. But the real import of it is you want a generation of young Chinese who understand how the American system works. So that if we have a crisis 25 years from now, you've got some very American savvy Chinese, and meanwhile you have Americans who are studying in China. We're down to a few thousand Americans studying in China now. Partly that was because a lot left after COVID, but a lot aren't going for fear of being imprisoned for nothing.
Who else would like to ask one from the audience? Yes, you at the back, sir.
Dave, just wondering what your thoughts on the future of America's relationship with Latin America is, given that it's a very weak point and that there is recent reporting that Russia and China are exploiting that situation there.
Well, certainly if former President Trump gets reelected, I think it's going to be a difficult road because he sees the issue through the single lens of immigration over the border. The second challenge that we face is a democratic recession in Latin America. Clinton used to hold these Latin American summits and talk about democracies that started at the very coldest reaches of northern Canada and would reach all the way down to the bottom of South America. Well, we all just saw the Venezuela election the other day, and that is not the only place where we're having trouble with the return of authoritarian leadership, or in that case, the refusal of authoritarian leadership to leave, even if they've just lost an election, and their work to go fix it. So I worry that this becomes easy recruiting ground for China and Russia. And I wouldn't be surprised, by the way, if you saw the Chinese and the Russians jointly work on developing a base or presence in Cuba again, and thus the risk of rerunning part of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yep, I can see it. Chap in the mask there.
Cheers, thanks very much. Thank you very much for coming in again and sharing all your insights, especially with respect to China and also Russia and some of the strategies that they're pursuing in the misinformation and disinformation space. I wanted to extend that query perhaps to efforts by the United States. There was recently a story reported in Reuters as well as in the New York Times, where there was a campaign run by the US and the Philippines with respect to COVID vaccinations. And I was just curious to see whether you might have any insights to share with respect to any campaigns that the US might run and what this might mean for the allies of the United States, such as the Philippines or Japan, or perhaps even Australia as well.
So the U.S. was running a campaign on COVID, and I think the American officials would say they're trying to run a factual campaign to counter, disinformation elsewhere. But the fact of the matter is, disinformations are a really hard thing for democracies to go spread. First of all, we're not very good at it, right? So that's number one. Number two, if the fundamental effort of exporting democracy or helping countries import democracy is that it's based on a fully educated and accurately educated electorate, whatever the country is, so that they can make informed choices about who they want to lead them. Having the U.S. try to go compete head-to-head with China or Russia or Iran on disinformation strikes me that it drags us down to their level. And this is a really hard problem because you see this stuff flowing into the United States or into one of the allied countries, into Australia or into Europe or into Japan. And your first effort is to say, well, we'll go give them a taste of their own medicine. It's not really what you want a democracy known for. And it's one of the reasons we're having so much trouble establishing deterrence in the cyber realm and in the misinformation realm, because you want to do activities that are consistent with your values. And you think over time, that's the strongest part of the attractiveness to other countries that might be weighing, do they want to sign up in China's camp, or do they want to sign up in the American Western NATO camp?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we can't win. The best we can do is try not to lose, because
that's right.
If we try to out disinform the other side, then we've lost our compass completely.
Right. I mean, the purpose of running a democracy is to run it on truth-based information.
Absolutely. I've got a couple online. This one's from Malcolm. I'm going to paraphrase slightly. It's about the contribution that you see from AUKUS, both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. What will its impact on the geopolitical balance be? I mean, I suppose that obviously depends somewhat on the success of the actual programs, but perhaps even just as a signal of cooperation between three major democracies. Will it antagonize China, Russia, etc. further? So I suppose, what's the net? Is it a net benefit or?
It's already antagonized China, and not a single sub has been built or delivered. Okay, so
it's a net negative right now.
Right. Well, I mean, if one of your strategic objectives is to push back on China by convincing them that Australia is firmly in the American Western camp and is going to help contest Chinese presence, say, in the Pacific Islands. I write a lot in the book about the Solomons, as an area the U.S. had liberated and the Chinese are now trying to dominate. If that's your measure of success, well, they're already well on the way. My big worry out here is that essentially we give them too much running room. But for all the reasons we just discussed, democracies are not great at blowing the whistle out here. I'd much rather hear Microsoft or Google or Recorded Future or somebody like that blow the whistle than the U.S. government.
I'll take another one online. This one's from Owen. Given Biden, well, I'll start again. Biden made a statement some time ago saying, we aren't returning to great power politics. Now, the question is a slightly provocative question. How long will it take before the United States accepts the new reality and we will see a re-emergence of spheres of influence? I suppose this guy's pretty pessimistic about the likelihood of the rules-based order persisting, or some kind of order persisting.
Everybody I know in a senior position in the US government and in many allied governments recognize that we are full on in superpower confrontation again. Now, they say that's different from going into a new Cold War. And one of the things that the title, which has New Cold Wars, the S being important, and it has done, is touched off a bit of debate in the United States, which as an author I'm not entirely unhappy with, about whether we've got the right analogy here. We heard Condoleezza Rice the other day at the Aspen Security Forum in a very public venue say that she thinks maybe the right analogy is the interwar period between World War I and World War II. That is a better analogy than the Cold War to the period that we're in right now. I hope she's wrong, because one of the nice things about the Cold War is that it ended cold, and the interwar period ended with World War II. So we want to be careful with the analogy that we pick. But we're in an era right now where the new confrontations we're worried about are essentially a lot less stable and predictable than the old Cold War was. Mm. And while I understand that every American president doesn't want to admit to the fact that you're in superpower competition, I guess one of the things I came to in the book was wake up and call it what it is, because you're not going to move on to the next stage of devising a strategy to counter it if you're unwilling to recognize it.
Sure. Take another one online. This is from Noel, essentially about whether firmer action is needed against social media platforms. So what steps are needed from social media platforms to protect our pluralist societies from toxic disinformation strategies that undermine social cohesion? Can governments force this? Now, I know you expressed some skepticism about governments defining truth, setting up a ministry of truth or something like that, and being the arbiters, or even governments supporting independent media. But what about a firmer hand against social media companies to act responsibly?
So the problem is, how are you defining act responsibly, right? There is a fine line between violating the First Amendment rights of people with whom you might fundamentally disagree and stopping disinformation and misinformation. So we've got a couple of models here. Okay, so the easy model, initially when the internet came into being, people said government should have no hands on this, and the companies should have no hands. It's a free and open market. And then we discovered you leave something to be a free and open market, and what do you get? Pet photographs, pornography, and disinformation, along the way. So then the social media companies began to say, okay, there's some narrow categories. They said, we just run the pipe, okay? We don't look at the sewage that's running inside it. We just set up the infrastructure. But then everybody began to say, well, look, we need some rules here on something everybody can agree we don't want in circulation, which was child pornography. And that was the first effort to sort of come up with an editing system. And in fact, you could do it automatically, because you could train computer systems to go look at images. And if they saw what looked like children in various forms of undress, something like that, you had something you could automatically cut out, and you could share it with the other social media companies. So one day I'm having breakfast with a friend of mine who works for one of the larger social media companies. It was actually Facebook at the time. And she said to me, David, we had the strangest case the other day. said, we have these algorithms, they're very effective at picking out child pornography. And then a museum was putting up an exhibit about the Vietnam War. And the first thing that they ran in the exhibit was that iconic photograph of the young girl running naked to flee napalm, right? There's an image from Vietnam that sort of sticks in your mind, that's it. And the system closed it down because it seemed to fit every parameter for child pornography. And so they had to organize an ad hoc meeting and decide that it was of historic importance and override the thing. And I said, congratulations, you've just had your first editorial content meeting. I've been sitting in them for 40 years, and your life's about to become really miserable. Okay. And sure enough, there were any number of other questions where you sort of had to decide gradations. Then it got more complicated because country by country, one's definition of what you need to edit out is different. So you go to Thailand and there's something critical of the king that would clearly be First Amendment protected in the United States, but it's a felony in Thailand. And boom, that's got to come out. So all of a sudden now you need both algorithms and human beings that apply local law. And then people begin to pull out of China because they didn't want to actually have to comply with the Chinese rules. And now in Russia, you can get prosecuted for calling the conflict in Ukraine a war instead of a special military operation. And you can imagine how complicated this gets. So on the one hand, we don't want the government doing this in the United States. On the other hand, what do you do about companies that operate around the world and want to operate by American values, but if they are going to be operative, if Facebook or Google or whatever wants to operate in Saudi Arabia, they've got to operate by Saudi rules. So there's nothing easy about this.
No, and certainly the borderlessness thing is that's a real bugger to have to deal with. I personally despair at the thought that that we look at all these potential solutions, whether they're technical solutions or have people holding editorial meetings and deciding case by case. That's too slow and cumbersome to deal with something as enormous as the amount of information that's spreading around the internet the whole time. But at the same time, I feel like we need to work towards some kind of solutions and just trying to have as sort of positive an attitude as we can. But personally, I find the open market of ideas or the digital town square that people like Elon Musk promote to be completely implausible metaphors for what we're talking about here. The First Amendment that your country has, it's a right to free speech, right? And you might have heard the expression, there's a difference between the right to speech and the right to reach. Are there not arguments for providing different incentives to social media companies so that their business model does not encourage people to prolifically share the most sort of emotive the material that appeals to the primitive part of the brain as quickly as possible, and that's the stuff that spreads, rather than something that might actually be a little bit more constructive to society.
I think that's absolutely right, but I'm not sure you can have the government playing that role, because what the First Amendment does is protection against government censorship. Microsoft and Facebook and Google and all that, they can set their own rules. They may act like governments, but they're not actually governments, right? And the bigger they get, the harder that issue becomes. Yeah. There was somebody here with their hand up for the longest time, and I think they were about to get
my colleague Daria. She'll have a really good question.
Oh, okay.
I hope so. Daria from ASPI. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on influencers. Here at ASPI, we've written a bit about sort of influencers both here in the West and in authoritarian countries being co-opted by authoritarian governments and used for propaganda or disinformation purposes. But I wonder if you had any views on whether they can also have a role in the other camp on sort of improving the situation, and whether governments can kind of work together with the influencers.
It's a really, really good question, because they're not really media in the way that we traditionally considered them, right? We have seen the Biden administration bring influencers in and talk to them in an effort to try to convince them on a policy issue, whether it was gun control or restoring Roe v. Wade or whatever. And the sort of interesting question that raises, is that the proper role of government? Is that any different, briefing the influencers, than what they do with us every day in the White House press room and try to convince us of the wisdom of certain policies along the way? I have no problem with the government making an effort to convince influencers. I do have a problem if it looks like the government is paying those influencers, either secretly or in some cases publicly. In a previous era, an influencer was an opinion writer at the New York Times, right, on the op-ed page. Now what's happened because of electronic media is the cost and barriers to publication have basically moved to zero, and anybody can be an influencer in hopes that they catch on. And we've seen President Biden give some interviews to influencers that I have to confess I never heard of, right? And we're sitting here complaining he's never once sat down for an interview with the New York Times or the Washington Post, but will happily sit down with an influencer. So that is how governments try to go influence the influencers, or depending on your point of view, manipulate the influencers. But I get nervous if I think the US government is playing a more direct financial role in the media. What?
Thanks. So we might have to finish it there. Sorry, Albert. So David's got some books to sign. We don't.
Yes, and if I missed any of you on questions, come by when I'm signing books, and I'll be around.
I think that'll work. So please give David a round of applause. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David.
Good job.